Hello, my dear Animaniacs. It's another episode of B-Movie Enema the series. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, B-Movie proctologist. That over there is Nurse Disembody. How's it going, Nurse?
I'm doing swell, Jeff. How about you?
You know, I can't complain, but I do wish Poop Shoot would hurry up and make with the movie already. We got a show to do.
Come on, PC. It's time for us to get this show on the road.
Hey, Poop Shoot, that wasn't nice.
Sheesh. No need to take my head off. I was just saying it was time for us to do our show.
You'd think he'd quit while he was still ahead.
No doubt. Also, bad joke.
Aha! The new movie is here. Let's find out what it is. Alright. Oh, it's a good one.
Ooh, what is it?
It's 1962's The Brain That Wouldn't Die.
Awesome.
Now, well, I say it's 1962. It was actually made in 1959. When it was shot in the village of Tarrytown, New York, it had the working title of The Black Door. And you know what? I kind of love that title. There are multiple ways you can view that title and how it connects to things in the movie.
I'm actually surprised it wasn't called I Was a Teenage Brain Surgeon.
Well...
You're kidding me.
Not exactly.
Now that's a dumb title.
Oh, and how? It was likely never going to be titled that in any serious way, but that was a suggested title from producer Rex Carlton. There were a lot of titles that had something to do with teenage in the title to lure in younger audiences. In fact, at times it was used as a joke too, but between 1957 and 1963, there were no fewer than 7 or 8 movies, shorts, or cartoons with I Was a Teenage Something or Another in the title. The most famous was I Was a Teenage Werewolf, starring Michael Landon in 1957. But in the years since, there have been other movies or TVs or shorts that use that same naming convention, likely as a joke in almost all cases.
I kind of want to see all of them. I'm not even kidding. I'm guessing almost all those movies with that I Was a Teenage Something or Other type of title are cheesy as all get out.
You know, maybe we can work on that at some point. But The Brain That Wouldn't Die was written and directed by Joseph Green. Now, Green only directed 2 films, wrote 2 films, and produced 2 films. However, no category has the same 2 films in all of them. But the only films that he wrote were The Brain That Wouldn't Die and the 2019 short Hidehauser and Hidehauser, which came out about a decade after Green had died, and really is just a sort of animated feature that uses stuff from The Brain That Wouldn't Die, which is where he gets the credit for the film's original stuff. But the 2 films he produced were American films imported from other countries: Daydream in 1964 and The Brazen Women of Balzac in 1969.
Okay, wait. Just looked up this Brazen Women of Balzac. IMDb says a count and countess, their love life losing luster, invite some people over. That's a porno, isn't it?
Oh, very, very likely it's at least a foreign sex comedy. Although, love life losing luster, that's some great alliteration.
Yeah, I like it.
Now, the only other film besides this one that Green directed was The Perils of PK. The Perils of PK was released in 1986, but starred a lot of older generation actors. I don't know if it was made at the time or earlier on, but it's about a former movie star who is now working as a stripper in Las Vegas, hoping for a comeback.
Between that movie and the one with the lusty lovers inviting some friends over, I'm starting to think Joseph Green had a type of movie he liked to be involved in.
You know, I think that's entirely possible, but producer Rex Carlton didn't do a whole lot of stuff with movies either. In the later part of the 60s, he teamed with famous schlockmeister Al Adamson. He wrote and or produced films directed by Adamson like Blood of Dracula's Castle and Hell's Bloody Devils. He did executive produce Nightmare in Wax and The Rebel Rousers, starring our Holy Father Cameron Mitchell.
Praise be to Cameron Mitchell.
So yeah, this is a movie that is headed up by a couple not very famous writers who also produced and directed the film, but neither did a whole lot before or after with their career.
What's weird is, isn't this one of the more famous B-movies?
Yeah, it is, but I think the popularity came later. Besides, it's not like today when an indie filmmaker hits with something that either gets a lot of critical or cult attention and they end up getting more popular or studio films. In the day and age of which this was made, these types of filmmakers made cheap B-movie horror movies or put their names on imported films. They weren't really going to benefit from a movie about a decapitated head being kept alive in a pan of goo.
Well, personally, I wish there were far more movies with heads in pans of goo.
You know, I have to say I agree.
Let's get into the movie. I'm looking forward to seeing it again.
Now, I think we better do what the lady says, so we'll be back after the first part of The Brain That Wouldn't Die and discuss some of the people we see in this movie. I absolutely love the opening segment of this movie. First of all, right out of the gate, it's very clear Dr. Bill Courtner is not all that sane. It's interesting to me that Dr. Bill is a flat-out villain, despite making a lot of his decisions based on what would, at least on the surface, seem fairly well-intentioned. However, it's not. Dr. Bill talks about using experimental methods. He actually saves a dying patient that he and his father are operating on using these experimental methods. This doesn't go over well with Dr. Bill's dad, and it brings up an interesting question, right? Like, why wouldn't a doctor try to do anything and everything to try to save a dying person? I think the main thing that Dr. Bill's father is kind of grasping onto is if Bill wants to transplant every organ or limb or whatever other body part, what does that exactly mean for the identity of the human race? Is Bill tinkering with elemental things that could lead to people losing themselves? Or is it that Bill's father is thinking of things in a more old world faith-based sort of way? If Bill is making all these breakthroughs, is he tampering with nature and or God? This was a part of the theme of Frankenstein. If Frankenstein built a living thing out of dead tissue, does that mean science kills religion? What does that make Dr. Frankenstein himself? Various depictions of Dr. Frankenstein would show the scientist as trying to see how far he can push nature with science, but oftentimes, especially in a Universal classic film from 1931, Frankenstein would eventually pull himself back from the edge of insanity through the help of his mentor and fiancée. But that is not what's going on in this movie. In The Brain That Wouldn't Die, Dr. Bill is already over the edge. He's been stealing limbs from the hospital morgue. His father even knows this. Bill has set up a secret lab out in the country to do his work. I assume that is to keep his father and Jan, his fiancée, from nosing around and finding out that he's been doing some fairly ghastly stuff. But when he gets a call from his lab assistant, Kurt, to come out to deal with an emergency, he and Jan race out to the country to his lab, and he's finally going to reveal to Jan what's going on out there. But he wrecks, and when he finds her dying, he takes off running with what we discover is her severed head. At first, you might think he's doing this out of love for Jan, but as we'll see, it's not really that simple.
I think it's kind of interesting how kind of sexual Jan and Bill are right there in the workplace. She talks about how his touch drives her crazy and all that stuff. Kind of mature for the late 50s and early 60s.
Yeah, this movie, as we'll be seeing very soon, has a definite lasciviousness to it. It's part of three things that make this movie kind of interesting for its time. I talked about how Bill isn't really ever shown in a good light. That will be made much more apparent very soon, too, as he decides to hunt down people to, with the proper body to place Jan's decapitated head upon. The second thing is the sexual nature of this movie. Sure, it was a B movie, but it wasn't exactly released that far outside of the mainstream. Jan is visibly turned on by Bill. Bill is going to be seeking her new body in red light kinds of places. Then, thirdly, this is really nothing more than a twisted Frankenstein tale. It's the reason why I specifically mentioned Frankenstein just a few moments ago in the first place.
You know, Jeff, I'm kind of thinking about this, and here's a question for you. Would you rather be dead or paralyzed by virtue of just being a head in a pan? Frankly, I'd rather be dead. I'm not too sure I'm as excited about Bill as Jan is. So if he's my doctor, I'll take the dirt nap instead of the pan of goo.
You know, I'm not entirely sure I want to just be a head in some goo either. I mean, sure, maybe he can put my, head onto a new body, but I'm not sure if I'd love knowing that he killed someone for that body. I've seen too many horror movies, so I know that body is going to have a mind of its own and seek revenge even though my head is on it.
Ooh, good point.
Now, let's talk about a couple of the people in this movie, and we'll start with Jason Evers playing Dr. Bill Courtner. While this is easily the most recognizable role for Evers, he had a pretty darn good career that spanned several decades. He started out on Broadway, which ultimately got him to Hollywood. Now, Evers did a lot of television dating all the way back to 1949 with NBC Presents. He did a lot of guest spots on several of the popular TV series of the 50s and 60s. That, of course, means a lot of work in westerns like Laramie or Tales of Wells Fargo. He landed his most regular gig on the early 60s show Channing, but he had 3 guest appearances on both Perry Mason and Gunsmoke. In the later 60s, he had guest appearances on The Big Valley and The Wild Wild West. And, of course, I have to mention he was Rail on Star Trek in the 3rd season episode Wink of an Eye. Now, I could list off a dozen more extremely popular TV series of the 70s and 80s that he appeared on, but just know that between 1949 and 1987, if there was a popular TV show, Evers likely guest starred on it at some point. Now, a couple of small roles he did have in 2 sequels were 1971's Escape from the Planet of the Apes and 1990's Basket Case 2. The latter proved to be his final film role. Evers eventually died at the age of 83 in 2005 from heart failure. Kurt was played by Anthony LaPena, who was a little bit more of a voice actor than an on-screen actor. While he did have a dozen more credits, including the spaghetti western Johnny Yuma, LaPena's greatest claim to fame was as a voice actor, dubbing for films that were either from Europe or where an actor had to be overdubbed due to the actor being foreign, working here in an English film. Now, he did dubbing for classics like Deep Red, Strip Nude for Your Killer, Inferno, Cannibal Ferox, and Hercules. All of these were films that were either made by or featured actors who were Italian. Now, Nurse, I think I've said enough.
I wholeheartedly agree.
So let's get back... Hey.
What? I'm only agreeing with you.
Fair enough. Now let's get back to the brain that wouldn't die, and we'll see what Dr. Bill's devious plans are to fetch Jan a brand new body.
Who doesn't like a stripper fight?
For sure. And the movie is kind enough to include a screeching cat sound effect just to remind you that this is indeed a hell of a cat fight between 2 strippers.
That's what strippers sound like when they fight, though, isn't it?
Well, I suppose we can go sometime and find out.
Sweet. I know just the place.
You do?
I had a life before I started working here.
Okay, of course, the most important person in this movie is Jan Compton, played by Virginia Leith. Now, let's not forget we've seen her before. Back in Season 3's finale, we watched Stanley Kubrick's first film, Fear and Desire. Now, Leith was cast in that as the girl. She was the unfortunate peasant girl who ran afoul of a group of soldiers who survived a plane crash. And they bind her to a tree to prevent her from telling anyone she saw them. And one of the soldiers is left to watch her, but he cracks and kills her when she tries to escape. Now, Leith had a fairly decent career. She was already in her 30s when she was in this film, but she had been known as the girlfriend of Jeffrey Hunter and Marlon Brando in the mid-50s. In 1956, she appeared in A Kiss Before Dying, which was a pretty darn popular film noir, which got a 1991 remake that was not as well received. But this was her last credit for 15 years before she reappeared on TV for episodes of Beretta, Starsky and Hutch, Barnaby Jones, and Policewoman. Her final credit was for the 1980 disaster miniseries Condominium, which starred Barbara Eden, Dan Haggerty, and Ralph Bellamy. Life died in 2019, and appropriately, she donated her body to UCLA Medical School.
I know it's kind of morbid, but considering this is her most enduring performance, yeah, that is totally appropriate.
Now, I really like her as Jan Compton. Life is an interesting actress. There is something rather appealing about her. She's not the most glamorous or sexiest of actresses, but she's very attractive. She also has that smoky voice, too.
Yeah, that really suits her well in this movie.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, she has to do almost everything with her voice and her face. She's also extremely despondent in this, too, so she doesn't want to be alive. I mean, she's just a head in the pan of goo, and that's fairly monstrous, and it certainly does nothing for her body image, I guess. Anyway, she also has developed an interesting superpower, too. You see that goo in the pan that her head's sitting in? Well, that has given her a psychic link with something behind a padlocked door.
Ooh, yeah. What's behind the door?
Probably nothing good, but very clearly there was already something more to what Dr. Bill is doing at his secret lab in the country. We know he's done some pretty gnarly things there. And it's actually kind of smart in a science fiction sort of way to connect the head in the pan, dubbed affectionately as Jan in the Pan, and the monster behind the locked door.
Her psychic link does kind of feel like it came out of nowhere.
I can kind of understand that in the normal scenario when it comes to how movies are typically constructed, but I will also say that I think it works in this movie situation because, I think this movie should connect Jan in the Pan to the monster behind the door because Dr. Bill is doing weird science. Having his creations starting to form a bond is a decent way to build tension as the movie rushes toward the third act.
I can see where you're going with that. It does make sense in a B-movie monster flick.
Yeah, and as I was saying, I do like how Jan is changing. I don't think it's the goo. I don't think it's her power to communicate with the thing on the other side of the door. I think it's pure anger and a true desire to be dead. It's not a common thing to hear from a lead character in a movie like this, at least in that time frame. If Jan had any ability to, I do think she would willingly and happily commit suicide. This would still have been a time in which the girl would have been whisked away by an admirer and kept safe from the monster. She, like Dr. Bill, shouldn't be this type of character. Dr. Bill seemingly is trying to save his fiancée, but is really just seeing how far he can take his weird science. Jan is becoming hateful and kind of twisted and evil in her own right.
Yeah, but her anger and hate is justified.
Oh, I 100% agree. It's a righteous evil. So again, this movie is playing with typical tropes and doing things in a slightly different way.
This is a good movie.
It really is. Earlier on, I mentioned this film's original working title was The Black Door. And here's where I can talk a little bit more about that on a contextual level. The Black Door could refer to his lab. It could refer to the door that his monster is behind. It could even refer to Jan wanting death and therefore to cross some sort of black door into whatever lies beyond. It could refer to Dr. Bill's experiments and how they have led him beyond a point of good science and into something more treacherous and self-centered. Now, that title could connect to any of those things. However, it's a little too smart of a title that has a woman's decapitated head in a pan of goo and a monster that she can telepathically communicate with behind a locked door.
Yeah, well, I prefer I Was a Teenage Brain Surgeon.
It should be noted that the film's end title card does indeed read a different title, The Head That Wouldn't Die. Now, I don't know the story behind why the movie has mismatched title cards, but the story goes that the film had to be named The Head That Wouldn't Die in order to pass the more stringent UK certification board for release.
They really missed out on an opportunity to name the movie I Was a Teenage Head Surgeon.
Yeah, I suppose so.
You know something? Kurt was working for Dr. Bill because he wanted the doc to fix his messed up arm. But after Jan started communicating with the monster, it turns out that Kurt ended up with 2 messed up arms.
But how about that model that Dr. Bill picked up that he knew from college?
The worst possible thing was for her to survive. I mean, she had issues with trust after a guy cut her face up. Now she was taken advantage of by an old friend and drugged and nearly had her whole head cut off her body.
She's had a bummer of a life, hasn't she? Now, she was played by Marilyn Hanold. It should be no surprise that she was a Playmate of the Month for Playboy in the June 1959 issue.
We watch a lot of movies with Playmates in small roles.
Now, we sure do. Now, Hanold didn't have a huge career, but she did have a decent career in film and TV. She was in an episode of Have Gun Will Travel. She was in an episode of Bewitched. She appeared in 2 episodes of Batman in 1966, but she had 2 fun movie credits near the end of her acting career. The first was as Princess Marquezan in Frankenstein Meets the Space Monster. She was actually the lead in that monster flick. Then, in 1967, she had a small part as an Amazon in Like Flint, the best American James Bond ripoff starring James Coburn.
Can we watch Frankenstein Meets the Space Monster?
Maybe, but first, let's hear your review.
You got it. This is an all-time classic B-movie. We have a mad scientist, a lab assistant with a physical deformity. We have a monster that reminded me of Sloth from the Goonies. We have girls slapping each other, a stripper fight. This movie has everything, but the best thing it has is a talking head. The Brain That Wouldn't Die gets an easy 5 poops out of 5 score.
Yeah, this is a really good one. That monster that reminded you of Sloth was played by Eddie Carmel. Now, he sadly didn't live very long. He died at the age of 36 in 1972 due to a heart attack. He was nicknamed the Jewish Giant. The Guinness Book of World Records listed him as 9 feet tall, but was probably more realistically more like 7 foot 3 inches. He did have the condition known as gigantism, which gave him his large stature. He later had acromegaly, which was caused by a pituitary condition. His maternal grandfather was also quite tall. While his parents were both 5'6", his mother's father was a towering 7'5", and he gained the title of the tallest rabbi in the world. Carmel ended up having an interesting career in his short life. He sold mutual funds, he was a carnival sideshow act, he was in a few films, he led a rock band, and then he was a stand-up comedian. Now, his rock and roll band, Nurse? Frankenstein and the Brain Surgeons.
Were they teenage surgeons?
To make you happy, I certainly hope so. Now, he ended up having to stop working a few years before his death due to painful arthritis. This progressed to him being wheelchair-bound before not even being able to get out of bed. At the time of his death, Carmel had kyphoscoliosis that decreased his height by several inches.
I see he and his parents were the subjects of a Deanne Arbus photo print that sold for $421,000 in 2007.
Yeah, Arbus photographed several oddball subjects that many wouldn't have, including strippers, elderly people, and people who had different conditions like dwarfism and gigantism. Speaking of photographers, there is someone of note who appears in the scene in which Dr. Bill goes to see the model, Peggy Howard. One of the photographers is played by Sammy Petrillo. Now, Petrillo was famous for being a comedian in the 50s. His claim to fame was partnering with comedian and crooner Duke Mitchell as an imitation of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis. Petrillo was pretty close in look and had a lot of the same ability to do wacky comedy that Lewis did. Now, Petrillo would later say that Lewis would create some problems for him and Mitchell as far as getting booked for acts. The pair went their separate ways on good terms, but he was good friends with Joseph Green and happened to be on set while Green was shooting The Brain That Wouldn't Die. For $90, Green put Petrillo into the scene as one of the photographers who took pictures of Peggy. I don't think he had a line, but his character was given the name Art. Well, Nurse?
Well, Jeff?
I don't think there's anything else we can add to The Brain That Wouldn't Die.
Nope, I don't think so either.
Alright, well, I guess this is the part where I tell you that we'll see you next week for another episode of B-Movie Enema, the series.
Wait, Jeff, what if we call the show I Was a Teenage B-Movie Enema?